Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Online Creators Association's Monday night stream. I just remembered that I labeled this one Thursday stream because I forgot how time works. Tonight we've got me, TX Watson, Argit, one of our mods, and we will have Han Kaylee shortly. They are currently switching over to StreamYard because I forgot to explain how our streaming setup works until a minute before we go live. But tonight we're going to be picking up on the conversation about the Consent Academy discussion call that we hosted with Chell Miller and Ariana. I need to start having people's names in front of me when I do these.
I don't know that they said their last name. It just Ariana.
I have their last name on a document in my notes that I just didn't think to open. Ariana Coveney. But yeah, while we wait for Han to get connected, Argit, how are you?
Doing pretty good. It's a busy work day, and oh my gosh, for anybody else living in the Midwest, we got hammered with a big storm, enough that there was hail. I went out and checked my car just in case. Thankfully the hail wasn't too bad here, but my welcome mat got blown into the neighbor's courtyard, so I wouldn't pick that up. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I haven't done much today. Did discover some rotten potatoes in my house, so we're dealing with a smell.
Okay. Yeah, where there's smell, there's almost always a rotten potato, I swear. Mm-hmm. Oops. Okay, yes, sorry. I also had unplugged my personal computer. Hey, if the work computer goes down with the ship in a bad storm because the power flickered a whole bunch, that's something that work can deal with. I don't have to deal with that. But my personal computer, I unplugged everything, and I was just making sure that I did in fact get the cable plugged back in and wasn't on a Wi-Fi because everything lagged for a second there.
Sorry about that delay. It would not let me type my name, but it also would not let me proceed without a name. So I had to type it in another app and then copy paste.
Bizarre.
Yeah. It also let me scan text to add it that way. So I almost entered the stream as Gideon the Ninth just because it was the closest text to me.
Han, welcome to the stream. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry?
Han, welcome to the stream. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello. Yes. Sorry. I thought we were still in green room. Hello. I'm Han Kaylee. I'm a medical humanities person. I do health equity work, and my involvement in TOCA is occasionally streaming and helping figure out things like document. I'm really helpful in a meeting sometimes. My superpowers are very boring.
All right, and so I actually went through the Consent Academy call and pulled clips this time. The thing that I definitely should have done last week. A couple of the things that I pulled contain some of the same stuff we talked about last week. I think most of it is sections that we didn't pull out last week, or parts from after the latest in the stream, or the latest in the video that we got to. But some of them just establish basic premises. So folks who are here for tonight's stream who were not here last week will know what's going on. And I'm going to pull the first one of those up now.
Started, what is your, and the Consent Academy's approach to understanding and talking about consent?
Yeah, this is a good question, because I think that when people hear the word consent, usually there's a lot of stuff that comes to mind. Usually they think immediately first about sex, and maybe they think about medical informed consent in the doctor's office. Maybe. And they tend to think about it in a sort of negative sense, a scary sense of making a mistake or having something bad happen to you or ruining the fun. People say that a lot when we want to talk about consent. So at Consent Academy, our model is a risk reduction model. So we don't come in and say, here's how you do consent. This is what consent is. This thing is always consensual. This thing is never consensual. Sure, there are some things like on extreme ends, but generally speaking, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the grayness of consent, the spaces where we actually live our lives. We talk about like different aspects of consent and things that affect it as a way to reduce the risk of violating someone else's consent or having our own consent violated. An example of that would be like in Washington State, where Consent Academy is based, technically, legally, you can't give consent if you've had any alcohol. And sure, that I see why they have that law. That makes sense. But if we get, say, people in our classes who are alcoholics or just people who really like to use alcohol, they and their partner really like to get drunk together and have sex or just kind of do anything. And then we come in and say, this is never consensual. Well, that's one, invalidating their whole relationship. And then also, like, why would they listen to us? Why would they then think about consent? So what we instead talk about is like, the lower your capacity, the higher the risk.
Yeah, so that's the basic like model of consent that the sort of call proceeds with. I think one of the things that like really sticks out to me thinking about it is just the idea of like the introduction of the idea of law, like the laws about which thing, like under what circumstances is consent possible as like a binary phenomenon. I think that a lot of the difficulty in our discussion about consent is that people conceive of consent as being like a question between a person and the government regarding that government's evaluation of their interaction with a third party, rather than being about their relationship with that third party.
I absolutely agree with that, and that certainly can create ethical problems in medical scenarios where something is formally documented as consent that is not informed, is not consensual, is not in good relation. So I think that's an absolutely really important thing to point out, is like what's the relation that's being centered.
Mm-hmm. I remember, forgive me for citing Tumblr, but I remember reading a Tumblr post years ago that was talking about a woman's experience of medical transition. I hope it was a trans woman. If this was a trans man's story, then I'm sorry for misgendering that person. But the author was talking about their experience of like going to the doctor to get a procedure done that in the state that they were in order to access like gender affirming care, you were required to be medically sterilized. And they were saying like, I think that they were at the hospital for that procedure. And one of the things that they said in the post was like, they got my consent over and over and over again. And the fact that they were asking for my consent so much was how I knew my consent was being violated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to move on to the next slide?
To some of the work that Consent Academy does, you know, in terms of understanding consent, not just in sexual contexts?
Yeah, for sure. So we've been around for 7 years now, give or take. And, you know, I've only been the co-director since this past January, but I'd been volunteering with the Consent Academy for many years. And my first involvement with Consent Academy was actually, I was trying to create a coalition of Seattle swing dance community leaders, like teachers, educators, venue owners, musicians, DJs, to talk about some of the social issues we were having. And a friend of mine was like, hey, invite Consent Academy to come and give a short talk. They could help a lot with this. And then I liked them so much that I hired them to teach at my wedding. So Consent Academy came and gave a lecture on things like relationship agreements and consent in long-term relationships. At my wedding, I was like, have a captive audience. But we've also taught for like Microsoft and Google. We've worked with the Amazon employees, things like the Linux Foundation. All these different sorts of groups have hired us to do things like teach them about how to have more consensual practices with interns. What do you do if your intern is 18 years old and has never had a job and has no idea about the fact that they're even allowed to set boundaries at work? We also work with things like, helping to train safety teams for events and helping community leaders know how to deal with issues happening in their communities before they get out of hand, and if possible, or if they've already gotten out of hand, sort of like how to help manage it. Because consent is part of everything. We can really apply it in any scenario. One of our sort of slogans is from the bedroom to the boardroom.
I still really love that slogan of being from the bedroom to the boardroom, because it's like it's one of the most personal, intimate things that a person could go to, all the way to one of the least intimate things, that everybody, so to speak, will encounter at least a few times in their life.
Yeah, and I think like it's a worthwhile exercise to think about like any given environment you're in, just like trying to figure out like what are the senses in which consent is relevant here, as opposed to like trying to figure out whether this is a situation where consent applies. And I think that like one of the big ones for content creators is the relationship we have with our audience. A lot of content creators really struggle to set boundaries with their audience, really like feel uncertain about like what is okay to say their audience is or isn't welcome to do or to say or to ask for. Or like, and there are a lot of audience members who firmly believe that by existing on the internet, people have consented to certain kinds of treatment. And that like it is not possible to withhold your consent for that.
My primary TikTok is about scholarship and activism, but I also have a cosplay account. And at the point on my secondary account where I realized that I wanted to be exploring some romantic topics, I realized that I needed to set boundaries about who I wanted to interact with me, and that obviously there's no way to do that structurally. There's just a like, please do not. And I initially set a like, no under 18 interact. And then I realized that I actually was not at all comfortable with a 19-year-old interacting with me either. And I was like, please do not talk to me if you are under 25.
Yeah.
Go to my other account, which is for everyone, but this one is not for under 25s. And I realized I needed to unfollow people, and that part of that was also like checking people's ages much more carefully before I interacted, and not commenting on a 21-year-old's post, because yeah, that's not what I'm there to do. It would be nice if there was a TikTok equivalent of I do not wish to be seen by straight people. I was gonna say but for minors, but to be honest,
everybody lies. I am the first one to say that. People will lie about that constantly. Like that's
Yeah.
Everybody wants to be something else. The grass is always greener, whether it's age or like gender or like where you live in the world, anything. Any personally identifiable piece of information. If a person decides, I don't want to be that thing right now, I'm going to be something else, and I'm going to try to just fake it until I make it, they will do that on the internet. Again, I still don't understand why. Like there's places for role play where it's acceptable to do things that are not, necessarily easily actually changeable as far as like a personally identifiable, like who you are thing goes. But like, anyway.
And I think, Margaret, we've had this conversation before, but I firmly believe that the fact that a barrier will be circumvented by bad faith actors,
Yep.
does not mean that that barrier has no value.
Correct.
It's like I feel like it's like how easy it is to enter a house with a locked door. Like, it's not actually very difficult to break into a house. Like, if you want to get into a house that has a door locked, it is pretty much safe to say just you can do that.
Mhm.
But the lock communicates a boundary,
Mhm.
and the lock creates like the level of friction against that boundary that forces a person who intends to circumvent it to unambiguously own the fact that they are circumventing it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And like, it's like in that same way, like if somebody like says, like, somebody in your comments say, like, you can imagine somebody in your comments saying, like, you're on the internet making thirst traps, you signed up for 16-year-olds thirsting over you. If there is an over 18 filter, you can say, no, I didn't. Those 16-year-olds lied, and like they violated my boundaries in order to access me without my consent.
Mhm.
Any more thoughts on this before we move on to the next one?
I just want to mention that YouTube has this content is not intended for children options. So tech is available.
Yes.
It does. That
Even if it's just a little message like that.
Mhm.
that filter is the barrier that filter cuts off at is 13, because it's not legal to target advertising to people under 13 years old, and Google lost a huge ass lawsuit about it.
Oh,
Yeah.
and so TikTok isn't available for people under 13.
Right. Yeah, that's why almost everything on the internet like says you have to be 13 to sign up.
Fair enough.
Yeah. That's because the other thought that still just kind of lingers in the back of my head too is that it's still there's still I've had so many conversations with people about this kind of stuff too, is that if a person is either omitting like what their age is to try to sneak in under the radar, so to speak, or anything like that, there's still some people who will never believe you if you didn't know. And then there's also still people who will continue to do that. And I can see also how like that gets really annoying when you do try to say like, well, this is my boundary. I would, for example, for your one account, I don't want to interact with anybody under the age of 25, but then some people will still do that. And it can get to be an exhausting uphill battle having to have the same conversation like on repeat. And again, some people, there's always new people coming, showing up. They may not always like go to a profile and look at it. So it's just, I know it's kind of a separate thought, but it's that it can become exhausting to keep having the same conversation about consent like on repeat, but we all have to be prepared for it.
Yeah, customer service mode, having to constantly remind yourself that each customer is a whole new person who
Yes.
has no memory of your conversation with the previous customer.
Yes. That is a fact.
All right, jumping on to the next one.
Also kind of reminds me of another kind of question that we had been ruminating on, is the strategies we use to disrupt these kind of harmful behaviors. In a lot of social media spaces, very high profile cases of sexual abuse, domestic violence, in particular the defamation suit against Amber Heard recently. That's something that's been occupying a lot of our feeds. And, you know, as a survivor myself, have been really impacted by it. But we've seen a lot of victim blaming statements, and I think the perpetuation of a lot of myths about what trauma looks like and how people experience harm. What are some ways that you've kind of tackled these sorts of issues, or, you know, ways we can all kind of address this when we see it happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is tough. I do think you're right about you're not going to usually change people's minds in like a comment on a Facebook news post, but like commenting on someone who you know and in your friend group and can help. I do get messages from people I haven't talked to since like middle school or high school every once in a while being like, hey, I know we never talk about like you're a Facebook warrior, whatever, as like changed my mind on so many things. Thank you so much for posting stuff. And so I think that this gives a good principle, which is like, even online, keeping the conversations more with people you actually have connections with tends to be more effective.
I don't have anything to say about this. I hate talking to people I know about things.
I think leading by example is underrated. I think often in like internet interactions, we often kind of want an immediate payout. We want it to work like a conversation with an NPC where we convince them and then they are convinced. And when I think about what things have influenced my consent practices in the last 5 years, it's not, I want to say usually or maybe ever, somebody saying, hello, Han, I think you should change this about how you do things. And I would be open to that if somebody did, you know, address me in that way. But it's mostly noticing that somebody else that I like being around is doing a thing that I'm not doing.
Yeah.
And it's usually not, I saw them do it once. It's, I saw them do it 5 times, and then I started to sort of remember to do it myself.
Mm-hmm.
And you won't see that you're the person who made that change.
Yep.
That's one of the things that I have talked to a lot of people about, is just the idea, like, when you are fighting with people on the internet about things, if you like, especially if you are having public fights, which is not a useful way to try and convince people of anything, but even to the extent to which it is ever effective, it is embarrassing to argue for something publicly and then change your mind. And like, in almost no case is a person whose mind you changed ever going to come and tell you that you changed their mind. And the more embarrassing in retrospect it was for them to have been defending the point that they were defending, the more likely they are going to like wait until you are no longer plausibly a part of their life before they actually implement that change in their worldview.
It's very true.
Or you'll get the retcon. I've always said that. I do not know what you're talking about. Please do not use the search function on my Facebook page.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something we don't really have much conversation on the internet about, the idea of like just letting people save face. Like,
Right.
My understanding from reading fiction written in or about the past is that the idea of saving face being like a normal part of social interactions used to be common.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too, I don't have any good examples jumping to mind. I know that there are a lot of them, but like people who, when they start to be like, okay, well, maybe I've noticed something problematic with this individual. So then they go through and like deliberately, intentionally, like scrape through all of their old everything for eternity because it's on the internet and people like either never cleaned it up or, you know, what have you. They're a different person here and now than they were the 5, 10, 15 years ago when they actually posted that on the internet. And it's like when they try to explain, I was a freaking idiot then, but because to these other folks it's new information now, they have this disconnect sometimes also about processing that information while acknowledging it's actually something that did happen in the past and maybe they've learned and grown from now, which again, also in like present day, if a person has something happening and people try to address it with them and they're going to try to make that change, we all are like, okay, so we hear that you do want to make the change. We hear that you are understanding that it is problematic, but also demonstrating your full understanding by like not doing it again in the future is also kind of expected of you, especially in these online spaces with, you know, creation in mind. And that's challenging also because there's also always going to be so many people having a critical eye for everything that you do.
All right, before we go on to this next clip, I want to just say something real quick, which is that the thumbnail for each of these clips is virtually identical, and I have lost count. So if I start playing one that we've already watched, sorry, I'll fix it.
I was going to say, I think we've done 3 clips now, so you should be on clip number 4, I think.
Okay.
We are trying to support, survivors of harm in our immediate community. It's very difficult because, like you said, we don't all realize that we all have a role to play in creating a safer community, whether it's online or, in meet space. We all do have a role to play in, supporting people who've experienced harm, validating what they've experienced and what they're going through, and, calling in the people in our community who do harm. It's always messy. No one wants to be called in or called out, and no one wants to get involved in some ways because it is uncomfortable, but it is worth doing because we can create safer and more inclusive spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super on topic. It's just like a continuation of the point we're on. Also, you can really see like my ADHD playing out in the drifting back and forth quality of my jump cuts.
Right. I know. I was trying not to giggle at that earlier because it's not like funny haha, but I was just kind of like, I know exactly what you did there and I love it. Like, hey, I'm actually like hearing all of this better than the previous time. Even though it's like, in-person conversations and whatnot, like you cannot expect a perfect like television quality flow of language to be coming out of each person at every moment. Lord knows I would never be able to do that myself.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, when you're watching a stream or when you're watching a video, you acclimate to the cadence of the people talking.
Mhm.
And when we are playing these clips, we are introducing a new thread, and the people watching haven't like spent time acclimating to the flow that conversation is happening at. So dropping them in and expecting them to like just be able to follow when it is like noticeably different than the flow of the people in the call they're currently watching.
Mhm.
It is harder. It's cognitively harder, and just like making those cuts, just taking out the breathing, can help. Did anybody have any thoughts about that clip?
Not too much at this point, only because it's like, again, it ties in so beautifully with
Yeah, it
all
kind of
of
is
the
like
conversation.
Chell was making the same points that we were making.
Mhm.
But all right, let's jump on to the next one.
Who, say, sexually assaults somebody, generally speaking, doesn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. They've usually crossed thousands of thresholds in public view and received no or very little pushback to the behavior, and it's really excused. And so we all have then a part to play in, how many times did this person like make really sort of objectifying comments about people privately that I just laughed off, or like how many times did I like notice these sorts of things and not say anything. And it's not to say like, oh, it's all my fault and I'm a bad person. No, it's more to say like, this is where we can start to institute change. We can, as a group of friends or coworkers, start to say, where can we also then change the structures we create to help prevent this kind of thing from happening again or reduce the risk.
This is so real. And as a survivor of intimate partner abuse, the thing that was effective in helping me recognize and leave that situation was that 7 different people in my community told me that something was wrong. And it's both in preventing harm and in interrupting harm. I've seen a lot of situations where something went wrong and there was an engaged community, and it meant that even if things went wrong to one level, they got out of that a lot faster than if the person didn't have that level of engagement. And so when we're engaged in that way, when we're caring about each other in that way, we can prevent a lot of harm and also disrupt harm that's already started.
Yeah, and I think another consideration is like Han, you were saying earlier about like just noticing people in your life behaving in a way and you just like incorporating that into the way that you behave. I think one of the things that like a common concern about like restorative justice practices, for example, is that they just like exclude the intention is just to exclude people who would commit crimes, for lack of a better word. But like, no, it's not that like a well-constructed system like that will just rely on exile. It's that people do change when their community expects it of them. And like, it is not necessarily the case that if your community has people in it who are harmful, those people will need to be removed in order for you to have a safe community. It can be the case that those people need to be exposed to a community that won't put up with that shit, but that is ready to be there for them and support them in growing past that shit.
I think it also, I keep in this conversation thinking back to Jewish theology, so I'm just going to dip into Jewish theology for a little bit. There's a concept of building a fence around the Torah that you don't just not eat pork, but you also don't eat something that looks like pork, so that if a person was looking at you, they would not get the false impression that you were eating pork and thus that it's fine. So there's a buffer zone, and I think part of what speaking up at the objectifying comment does is, even if you were of the belief, which I don't think you should be, that an objectifying comment is a tolerable level of harm, that it doesn't, like, it's not your business, it builds a fence. And it says, like, we're going to stop it before it escalates. And I think that that's such a protective attitude. And I love the risk reduction framework. I think it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. It immediately made me think of Impossible Burgers and pleather. Just like, we have so many products that are like, we recognize that there is this moral wrong in our supply structure from some perspective. Let's figure out how to make a product that allows for a person to appear to be committing that wrong while not literally doing it. And I think that this next bit coming up talks about it's referring to an experience in a community that Ariana had been a part of, and I think it might have been going back to the anyway. There's not context for the community, but that context isn't really necessary to understand what she's saying. Just like, heads up, she's referring to something specific that is not specified.
I think they had no idea even how to do that, and were just sort of so stressed by it they wanted to kind of like back away and be like, I don't want to think about this, let's just move on. But it's like the community knew about what was happening. All the people who were like, came to our stuff knew what was happening, but we didn't do, I think, enough to really like bring them in and give them tools and resources to process, build greater community cultural change, talk about things like consent more, talk about like have even a real conversation about it. Instead, it just turned into this like weird war of gifs on Twitter. I'm not even joking. And like then we all kind of scattered, and that group of people, we don't, even the ones of us that were not in conflict with each other, there's nothing. There's no like real connection and coordination anymore. And that's a big loss. And I think that thinking about harm on all these different levels, rather than just like, there's the good person and the bad person, and like, that's it. It's like, well, it's always more context to it. It's not to say that the person who caused harm isn't ultimately responsible for the choices that they made, but there are also things that encouraged and enabled those choices. And I really also tried to call my partner and I for the men in this group of people to do like a men's consent support group and like actually talk to each other, because this guy sort of behind the scenes was saying really sexist, objectifying things about me and some other women in the group. And all these guys would just kind of laugh it off and not push back or really do anything. And we all found out about it afterwards. And then there was no follow-up. There was nothing. We just kind of dropped it. And I feel like that's also like a real tragedy, because our connections were also primarily online, and we could have done so much. This could have ultimately been a thing that created a lot of growth and healing for the community at large, which was like hundreds and hundreds of people. And instead, it just kind of created this rot, and then the floor gave out and it was over. And I tell this story because I want it to be like a cautionary tale for people. Again, the values you have now, the structures you create now really set up what your community is going to look like in sometimes a year, 5 years, or an online space is a matter of months. And so really caring for it, tending to the spaces we create is so important.
Yeah, I felt like this was really important to talk about, just because I think it's really important to talk about how easy it is for an online community to just die, and how much violations of consent and like a failure to a failure to engage with those issues in the community can fully destroy online communities, because it's so much easier to just leave than to continue sticking around when there's a vague, uncomfortable thing happening at the underneath every conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Dealing with that a lot again on the app in my own little circle of people, and it's just like, this is exactly what we're talking about. There's quite a few people who are trying to put down the boundary of like, by the way, if you support any kind of bigotry, if you really need it spelled out, we'll spell it out for you. But if you support any kind of bigotry, please do not engage with our content. In fact, it would be awesome if you actually just exited the community if you do not feel willing or able to, maybe stop being a bigot.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are like, no, you're being a bully. You are harassing. You are yeah, I'm being mean to you. I mean, if the shoe fits, but if it doesn't apply, let it fly, right? Like, I love those phrases on this, for these kinds of situations. It's like, okay, so if I said, please don't be a bigot on my page or in my space or, whatever. And if you are feeling personally attacked by that, I'm just asking you to maybe self-reflect on yourself. Sorry if I did, attack you. It probably wasn't personal, but in 5-10 years from now, I hope to never have to have that conversation again. That's it.
And yeah, we after the call last Thursday morning, we talked about wanting to do another call like this or other events of some structure to get more into the ways that issues of consent intersect with the internet, because like that is what we had like wanted to do the call about, and this call wound up being like all of the groundwork necessary to have that conversation. And only near the end did we start getting into like, and these are specific applications for the way that this like plays out online. But yeah, I think that like one of the biggest takeaways for me in this call that is that like if you don't deal, like you can't sweep things under the rug online. If you do that, your spaces die. You have to deal with them. It doesn't matter like you don't, and that doesn't mean any particular method of dealing with them, but like they have to be addressed explicitly. Whatever it is you decide, you have to do that intentionally. You have to let the consequences for that decision play out.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the alternative is to try to shut down conversation about the topic. And at that point, the more sort of admin repression there is, the more pushback there is to that. And then
the more conversations go off the platform, the more people start to get used to being in touch with the parts of this community they care about outside of the community. Those spaces are less stable, so they fall apart too. But like that only happens after the main place is falling apart.
Right.
Yep. That was another one of those pieces of the conversation that it's like, we're trying to bring that up with a couple of people too. It's like, okay, so these things are being called out here in this space on TikTok. Well, if you hop over to Twitch or Twitter or wherever into the same space without and expecting like it's going to be okay, we're just going to like let it ride old school style before people were like even talking about these things like openly. Eventually it's going to happen there again because boundaries aren't laid. People are from different, everything. So sooner or later, history will repeat itself.
I think ultimately, particularly for group administrators, people in a formal like moderating role,
Yeah,
it can be a really hard lesson that setting clear boundaries will actually save you a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
It seems like trying to be as permissive as possible will keep the group, everybody just does what they want. And there was, I moderated a trans group on Facebook that was, I think at the time it was around.
We can't hear you.
Oh. How about now?
Yeah.
Better.
There was a group, there was a big blow up in the group around the emergence of Black Lives Matter and what things were going to be allowed in the group and what things were not. And it was a big controversial policies were that we weren't going to tolerate racism and we weren't going to tolerate gender policing. And a splinter group formed that had no rules in all caps as part of it. And within 3 months, they had changed the name to still all caps, some rules. I was like, yeah, because it's kind of hard to have a community because there's no rules.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, I've witnessed that time and time again too. Like you do have to be very clear. And if you're going to make a change, for example, in your example, needing to adapt to like, yeah, by the way, Black people might be trans too. Other people, all of everybody, all of humanity. So maybe let's not try to eject a huge part of the community. Well, I say huge, but not, sorry. In all of that, yeah, that's also really difficult too. And then trying to communicate that both like through announcements and then keep it clear in the text, and then it's a lot.
Yeah.
All right. This is the last one that I've got.
Fantastic.
Too much into history, but like during the civil rights movement, there was really active effort on the part of things like the CIA to delegitimize a lot of activist groups, to prevent things like coalition building, to make us feel that if we don't agree on every like niche policy point that we're like mortal enemies. And like that worked and those effects still persist. And the demands of, capitalism and all this other stuff really make a lot of grassroots activism and community change efforts harder. So the couple couple of things that I really want to add to this is like, if you want to try to make a difference in the world, first see if there's an org that's in your area that's already doing this work, because there probably is, and they probably desperately need volunteers and funding. I saw after the news about the potential Supreme Court ruling related to Roe v. Wade, a lot of feminists that I knew online, mostly white women, were like, we're going to create these networks and like these secret things. And like there are lots of these orgs already exist. There's so many of them, and they need funding and they need support. You do not need to reinvent the wheel. But that also brings me to the second point, ego in activism, because a lot of them did not want to hear, hey, those orgs already exist, because they wanted to be a hero. And if they weren't the person at the front of the ship commanding everything, they felt like it wasn't worth it. And that's so sad, because like any of this kind of activism is heroic. And if we remember that it's not about us, that's also so much healthier. The reason why this is also healthier is because it makes it so much less stressful. Remembering that you're not alone in these fights. There's so many of us working on these things together, that our fates and our liberation is all tied to each other, that coalition building is like the way to win. And like we don't have enough of that. We really get into this, like, again, if we don't agree on everything, then we're enemies. And it's like, well, probably we have so much more that we do agree on than we don't, and we'll be so much more effective together.
I love that whole part of the conversation too.
What?
I love that whole part of the conversation too, is that reinventing the wheel for every little thing, every thought on your mind, every passion you want to pursue, especially when it comes to social issues or other interpersonal issues like that too. It's very important to remember that you're probably not the first one to think about that. There's maybe somebody, when there is a gap, you can be the one to work on filling that, but like it's a lot.
Yeah, I feel like the thing about ego is really important, and like not to suggest that I don't have this problem. I'm literally just am a person on the internet for a living. I have plenty of ego, but we have this very strong cultural tendency in capitalism to reduce complicated endeavors to a handful of people, a handful of important people. Like films are directors and lead actors. Movements are organizers, candidates. Trying to think of other examples off the top of my head of complicated things that happen. Businesses are CEOs. And like that's never the case. And the people you're thinking of are never so important that the other people not showing up wouldn't have affected the product. Like in most cases, for every one person who feels like the essential person who made this thing happen, there are like 200 other people who, if no one was doing their job, this thing wouldn't have happened. And a lot of people thinking about going into activism aren't really ready for that idea that like what they are doing matters and is important because someone needs to be doing it, not because it's the thing that will be like written down.
There is a concept that I find very helpful about this. And the book about it is on my other shelf, which is fun. Oh no, it's right here. No. Okay, this is fun. Tragedy.
Totally fine.
So how long? African American Women in the Struggle for Civil Rights by Belinda Robnett talks about the concept of the bridge leader in social movements who connects local communities with national movements through their own pre-existing relationships. So she talks about how in the civil rights movement in the United States, people wanted to talk about Martin Luther King Jr., but the people who got people to show up to march with him were not him, and it was mostly women who were calling all of their friends from church.
Mhm.
And I think that concept of how to do leadership within an existing project might be really helpful for people who have a big drive for leadership, and also recognize that you don't need to start a new thing. There are things already. And it can be like,
Yes.
yeah, push that drive for leadership towards calling your 10 friends and getting every single one of them to come to a meeting with you. And that is absolutely critical movement leadership.
Mhm. Do we have anything else we want to say on the topic?
I think I'm about good because it's like, like, I'm sorry, Han, but because we talked about it last week also, I'm not saying that I'm fatigued talking about consent at this point, but I feel like between the two live streams, I've said a lot.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to listen a little bit more, so which is hard anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to hopefully being able to organize those follow-up conversations because I am definitely excited to like dig in more to like how this specifically affects creators in their capacity as creators.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's all we've got on that topic. Before we sign off tonight, though, I just also want to say, and this is completely off topic, but one of TOCA's mods, Amelia Som, was on a charity stream with unprepared casters the other night. It was a battle royale with 12 people from 12 players from various unprepared casters seasons, and Gus Rachel's GMing. They were raising money for Trans Lifeline, and their goal was $1,000. They had a bunch of rewards you could buy where that like affected the gameplay. Like you could buy people levels or equipment or healing potions and stuff like that. So they had already raised more than $1,000 when they went live. The live stream started at 5 Central, which I'm going by Gus's time. And it ran for 9 hours, during which time they raised $26,000.
Dang.
That's amazing.
They were $4,000 short of how much Xbox donated to Trans Lifeline, which is something that Haley looked up right near the end. But yeah, no, they stopped increasing the goal after at 20,000. They like Gus was like, "We're done increasing the goal. Like what are we doing?" Then at one point he changed it to 222222222, just like all twos because he thought it was funny. And then they hit that goal, and then it just kept going up. At one point, the chat just decided that one of the remaining players, Captain Remini, needed to be level 20. The character started at level 5. It was $200 to buy somebody a level. So just on leveling Captain Remini alone, they raised $3,000.
That's very cool.
Yeah, and I just it's a really cool thing that happened. One of my friends and a TOCA mod was involved in making that happen. Amelia survived to like more than halfway through counting by deaths. And yeah, I just want to shout that out before we log off tonight. Yeah. That's it. I don't have anything else to bring up right now. I think we're probably going to do TikTok news on Thursday because it's been a bit since we've done it, so there's probably news.
Just a little bit.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank-
Thank you, Han and Argit, for joining us.